to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I'm doing something a little bit different today. I'm actually the guest on the show, and I want to talk about, is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, a real disorder? Now, there are three things I hope that you take away from this. I want you to learn a little bit more about ADHD than you might currently know. And hopefully just to understand, how is it that mental health professionals go about determining whether a person has ADHD? And to answer this question, is ADHD a real disorder? I want to point out some of the arguments for ADHD as a real disorder, as well as arguments against, and just kind of see where this leads us. So this question, what is ADHD? Well, Russell Barkley, who's been in this field for many years, has talked about this, and he refers to talks about the holy trinity of ADHD symptoms, those being hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattention. So let's just look at hyperactivity first. If you think back to elementary school, you probably remember certain classmates who were in constant motion. They could just never sit down or keep their mouth shut, or maybe found an excuse, any excuse in the book to get out of their seat, to move around. Maybe you were one of those kids. But, excessive energy is characteristic of many forms of ADHD. Impulsivity is another one. It's not uncommon for kids with ADHD to not give second thought to the consequences of their actions. So they stick their feet in their mouth by saying something like, "Oh, I like the way your hair looks today, Jessica, but that dress makes you look fat." And, these kids usually don't realize how they come off to their peers, and then wonder why other kids don't want to hang around with them. And then there's inattention. And, as the name implies, kids have difficulty paying attention for very long, especially when they're doing something boring or monotonous. I'll have parents tell me, well, Johnny can play video games for so long and not have any problems, but when it comes to doing his homework, he just can't stick with it. So, in the classroom, you hear teachers saying things like, "Adam, pay attention. Adam, look at me. Adam, get back to work," that kind of stuff. So if you Google the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition criteria of ADHD, you'll see that there are 18 symptoms, 9 of which pertain to symptoms of inattention, and 9 of which pertain to symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity. And you'll see things like, for inattention, you'll see things like often fails to give close attention to details, often has difficulty sustaining attention, doesn't seem to listen when people speak to them directly. Or for hyperactivity, impulsivity, often fidgets or taps hands or feet or squirms in seat, leaves seat in situations when remaining seated is expected, like in school would be a good example of that. Is often on the go, as if they're like driven by a motor. So these are the typical things that you'll see, and these are what mental health professionals consider when they make diagnoses. The other thing that they'll take in consideration is whether the client shows a sufficient number of symptoms in either of these categories. So they have to show at least 6 out of 9 symptoms in the inattention category or hyperactivity, impulsivity category to meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. So it's possible, let's say, that a child might have 7 out of 9 of those symptoms in the inattention category, but maybe none or just a few in the hyperactivity, impulsivity category. If that's the case, they might be assigned a diagnosis of ADHD predominantly inattentive presentation. If, on the other hand, they showed 7 or 8 in the hyperactivity, impulsivity category and few or none in the inattention category, they would be assigned a diagnosis of ADHD, predominantly hyperactive, impulsive presentation. And then if they're showing, at least 6 in both of the categories, they would be assigned a diagnosis of ADHD combined presentation. Now, it's just not a matter of them showing, sufficient number of symptoms, but they also have to have a history of these symptoms dating back prior to the age of 12. So an adult might come in and say, I haven't been able to pay attention or concentrate very well at work. I'm not sure really what's going on here, and I think I have ADHD. Well, tell me a little bit about what you were like when you were a kid. When you were in the classroom, do you remember the teachers telling you, Johnny, get back to work. Johnny, pay attention. Or, Johnny, stop talking. Johnny, get back in your seat, please. You're always getting out of your seat. Were they saying these types of things? So they have to have that kind of a history as well. Now, here's the question. Doesn't everyone have ADHD to some extent? How many times have you been doing something, whether it's something at work, watching a TV show, reading a book, and find out that your mind starts to wander. And then you catch yourself and think, hey, why did I start thinking of that? I need to get back to work or get back to my show or, whatever it is that you're doing. It happens to everyone. Or how many times have you been doing something and find yourself squirming around in your chair or getting out of your chair to walk around because you're restless? I do that all the time at work. All of us do this kind of stuff. And it doesn't mean that we have ADHD. If you think of the bell-shaped curve, you may have learned about this in a math class or in a statistics class. You might remember that there's a big bulge in the middle of that curve and that there are 2 tails on either side of that bulge. Well, if you consider a person's attention span or activity level, most of us pay attention fairly well or moderately active. And so if we're at the same level as most folks, we would fall in the middle of that curve. That shows that, for the most part, that's pretty much the average range. That's where most people score, where it would fall. But other people have a lot of problems paying attention or can't stay seated for very long at all. And they don't come close to where most people fall. And so they're in the tail at the left side of the curve, where other people might have laser focus and be able to, be on that other side, on the right-hand side of the curve. So although all of us don't pay attention or stay still 100% of the time, it doesn't mean we have ADHD. So one way we know that ADHD is a real disorder is by contrasting those with a unique set of symptoms from those who don't have those symptoms, or at least don't have them to the same extent. And so a diagnosis of ADHD depends on a couple of things. It depends on the nature, the frequency, severity, and duration of the symptoms. And in fact, that applies to a lot of psychological disorders, but we're just focusing on ADHD today. So people who show more of these symptoms on a more frequent basis over a longer period of time and find that it interferes with how well they do in school or at work or in relationships, they would be more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. So let's look at some arguments for ADHD. The field of psychology, it's a little tricky because you're dealing with human behavior. And when you conduct research with humans, there's always going to be variability and problems with measurement, which is different from studying something like, chemistry or physics, where variables are more consistent and predictable. So you're always going to find some research that points in one direction and research findings that that points in a different direction. And so with that in mind, let me provide you with some arguments for ADHD and then some arguments against ADHD. So one of the arguments for ADHD has to do with DNA. I'm by no means a neuroscientist, but let me point out a couple of things that provide biological evidence for ADHD. A few years ago, there were some scientists in England who found that kids with ADHD were more likely to have specific segments of their DNA missing than other kids, which causes their brains to develop differently and to mature more slowly. So that's some evidence. There's also heritability. Kids with ADHD are more likely to have a parent who had or still has ADHD. In fact, what the research shows is that in about 50 to 60% of the cases, ADHD kids have a parent who had or has ADHD themselves. And I can't tell you how much that happens in my clinical practice. When I'm talking to a parent about their child, they'll say, when we started looking into ADHD, we looked at some of the symptoms, and by gosh, I have a lot of those things. Can I be tested for ADHD too? It's one of those things. So that's very common. There are also twin studies. A child with an identical twin with ADHD has a 3 in 4 chance of having ADHD themselves. MRI scans, you look at those have consistently associated ADHD with less thickness of gray matter in the frontal cortex, which is important for, it's what psychologists call executive functions. So that area of the brain controls things like, planning, organizing, problem solving, that kind of stuff. So if that's the case, how would you expect a kid, in school to be able to do the things that they need to do, keeping their books and stuff organized, being able to plan for assignments, all that kind of stuff when these areas of the brain aren't working like they should. PET scans also provide evidence. When people with ADHD perform a task, certain areas of the brain are less active compared to people who don't have ADHD. And once again, if you look at the prefrontal cortex, you'll see that there's not as much activation there as compared to controls. And then I think the other thing too is that ADHD kids, they produce lower levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which neurotransmitters are those special chemicals in the brain that allow us to do different types of things, perform different types of behavior. So dopamine helps with things like attention and motivation. So, you've probably heard of the medication Ritalin. Ritalin and other stimulants, it helps increase the production of dopamine. And this might explain why people with ADHD are more likely to abuse nicotine and drugs. Nicotine, cocaine, methamphetamine, it improves dopamine brain function and makes them feel better. All right, now let's look at some arguments against ADHD. There are some scientists who argue that, ADHD it isn't a real disease. And, kids who are labeled as having ADHD might actually have something else going on. I mean, if you look at it just very basically, it could be normal behavior that's misdiagnosed as ADHD. An energetic child may be perceived as having ADHD because the parent doesn't have a basis for comparison, or the basis of comparison is another child that's much less active, and so the second child gives the appearance of being hyperactive. Well, it also could be a physical problem. Like, let me give you an example. Hypothyroidism, or an underactive thyroid, people who have this, they'll complain of things like mental fogginess or memory problems, attention problems, low energy. Where people who have hyperthyroidism, or an overactive thyroid, it's just the opposite. Restlessness, nervousness, attention problems, all of these things will give the appearance of ADHD. It may not be ADHD at all. It could be a different psychological problem. Like if you look at things like depression, anxiety, learning disabilities, there's a lot of diagnostic overlap between those, meaning that in all three of those cases, depression, anxiety, learning disability, people will have concentration problems. They'll appear restless, distractibility issues. And so you really have to wonder, is it really ADHD or one of these other things? Or couldn't it be something in the environment? Is there something that's happening at home or school that's creating the appearance of ADHD? Maybe there's a lack of structure in the home. So, the kid roams around the classroom because that's what he's allowed to do at home. He's just doing what comes natural to him. He doesn't have ADHD. So here's my takeaway from all of this. You have to be cautious. If a child, or an adult for that matter, is suspected of having ADHD, the first thing a clinician should do is ask about the symptoms to find out if the client meets the criteria for the disorder. But the clinician should always ask himself or herself, what else could it be? And this can be done by finding out about physical problems and disorders, maybe substance use disorders and environmental factors that we were just talking about. So I hope that this was helpful for you today. I know that this is a shorter podcast than usual, but I think that some of these things are relevant and helpful. So if you are a practicing clinician, that you think twice before you diagnose a person with ADHD, and always ask yourself, what else could it be? Okay, I hope you have a great rest of the week, and thanks for joining me on the Make a Mental Note podcast.